Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the keynote presentation of this year's version of the Elakha Alliance Sea Otter Science Symposium. The title of this session, as you can see on your screen, is The Magic and Majesty of Kelp Forests, kind of an interdisciplinary and creative view of how we see and process and understand these places of mystery that really are the focal point of everything we want to do in restoring sea otters to the Oregon coast. We're lucky tonight to have three people from bringing different points of view on this. Kyle Cavanaugh, who professor at UCLA, Patrick Webster, who's associated at least in some way with the Monterey Bay Aquarium, but he does a lot of photography on his own, and Emma Akmakdjian, who is a graduate student at UCLA. Is that right? I think that's right. And I'm just going to leave it there because their work speaks for itself. So who's going to start?
Emma's going to take the lead, and also we'll do a Q&A if you want to use that feature on your Zoom panel at the bottom and enter questions throughout their presentations, and then we'll answer it all at the end. Okay,
thank you, Chanel, for picking up the ball on that. Emma, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Bob and Chanel. It's an honor to be here at the Sea Otter Symposium, talking about the thing that we're most passionate about, which is the kelp forest ecosystem. So as it was previously mentioned, we are three interdisciplinary researchers, professors, professionals from the fields of geography, photography, and in my case, art and design. We met each other because we have this mutual interest in visualizing what's happening with the kelp forest. As we might know, many of you probably know already, a lot of them have been diminishing from human ecological impacts, from trophic imbalances in that ecosystem. And so in each of our particular mediums, we've been trying to grasp an understanding of that life cycle of kelp. How is it adapting, or is it not adapting to warming ocean temperatures? How is it affected by this loss of predatory species? As we know, sunflower stars and the very charismatic sea otters. So today we're speaking together because we're working on a project to 3D model some of the kelp forests off of Port Orford in Oregon, and to learn alongside and from Elakha Alliance about their plans to reintroduce sea otters. So through art and science, we hope to visualize what a successful restoration project could look like in the future. And so that would start by documenting a space now on the reef and revisiting it in 10 years and seeing, wow, sea otters have really made an impact here. And to imagine that through film, photogrammetry, 3D modeling. And so, you know, a lot of you are here because you are really passionate about the charismatic and heartwarming sea otters. And you know, we love them as well, but we are here for the kelp. We're really excited about the primary producers, the home of the ocean, and that foundation. Without that foundation, we would not have the conditions for these very charismatic creatures to continue to live. So our presentation today will have three of us speaking, and we'll begin with Kyle Cavanaugh, professor from UCLA in the Department of Geography. Take it away, Kyle.
Great, thank you very much, both Bob and Emma, for those introductions. How does my screen look? Everything look okay? Cool. And a big thanks to the Elakha Alliance for inviting us to come give this keynote. This is exciting and thrilling for us. So I'm going to start with the science end of things, and then the slides will get more and more beautiful, you know, throughout the as I pass the baton. But I think there's some beauty in the satellite mapping of kelp that I've been focused on, and over the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to briefly talk about some of my research using satellite imagery to look at trends and variability in kelp abundance along the entire west coast of North America. And a big part of this is introducing Kelpwatch, which is this new web-based application for sharing and visualizing this data with the public. And with Kelpwatch, you can check out how your favorite kelp forest has changed over the last 35 years or so. I'm hopeful that the tool may be of interest to some of you, and whether by supporting future feasibility studies, identifying potential restoration sites, potentially serving as a baseline for examining the effects of future interventions such as sea otter relocations or just curiosity. The Kelpwatch tool and the research behind it has very much been a collaborative effort. And so I want to acknowledge the rest of the team, particularly the Nature Conservancy, who has funded the project, provided a lot of the development support for the tool. Now, my research focuses on trying to understand patterns and drivers of variability in kelp abundance on large scales. The focus on giant kelp and bulk kelp, those big charismatic canopy forming species in this region. I'm currently working on a project to characterize long-term trends in kelp abundance and then also examine the impacts of a major marine heat wave that impacted this entire area between 2014 and 2016. And luckily for us, remote sensing jockeys, giant kelp and bulk kelp form this floating canopy that are relatively easy to detect from above, from airborne, from satellite imagery. And so a lot of my work involves creating standardized data sets from multiple sensors, multiple sources that allow us to look back 30 or 40 years or more in some cases. So to perform retrospective surveys, start to identify long-term trends, which enables us to put some recent changes in a broader historical context. A lot of my work utilizes Landsat. This is a satellite program run by NASA and the USGS. It's actually a series of satellites that provides more or less continuous monitoring back to the early 1980s. So it's a fantastic time series. The imagery has 30-meter resolution, though relatively coarse. We get images every month or so. And so the result of all this data is a time series of kelp cover at 30-meter pixel level with seasonal coverage from 1984 to the present. And that's what I'll show with the Kelpwatch tool. I do want to acknowledge some limitations of this data. So with that relatively coarse resolution, it's not good for picking out for detecting small sparse canopy, especially canopy close to the shore. So it's not going to give you a picture of every single kelp forest out there. We're only monitoring floating kelp, only detecting floating kelp. So we can't determine what's happening underneath the surface of the water, whether there's subsurface kelp existing, whether it's just a loss of canopy or the loss of the entire plant. And also with the satellite data alone, in areas where kelp is absent, can't really tell if it's due to environmental conditions, urchin overgrazing, a lack of kelp spores getting to suitable habitat. So some of the inferences, you need to bring in other data sets, other knowledge to get at that. Now, Kelpwatch is this tool that we've developed to share this data, and I'll give you the link in a moment, but I wanted to give a quick overview of the interface. And like I said earlier, I'm hopeful that the tool might be of interest to some of you. And so I've created this little video to show the interface. This is the map interface. But first, I want to show the methodology tab. This has more information on the methods that we use to develop this data set. I especially want to point out Sarah Hamilton's work. She led this paper where the methods for applying this to bulk kelp were developed and validated. And she'll be giving a talk tomorrow, I think, going into the status and trends in kelp in more detail, especially along the Oregon coast. So check out that paper, talk to Sarah if you want to learn more about the methods with respect to bulk kelp. Back to the map interface, this allows you to explore dynamics of kelp in different regions. So it's kind of like Google Earth. You can zoom into your area of interest. And once you get close enough, you'll see a time bar along the bottom of the screen. And so the gray areas are potential kelp habitat that are currently unoccupied. The blues and greens are occupied at this point in time. And if you look at the bottom, that shows Q3 of 1984, so fall of 1984. Blue and green areas are occupied, that shows density. Then this, like for a period where the kelp shows as white there, this is winter of 1984, it just means we don't have an observation. So, typically due to cloud cover. Now we'll run the animation and you can visually see changes in kelp canopy in this area around Port Orford. Periods where kelp is relatively low, see, rapid recolonization like now, shown by the blues and greens, periods where we don't have data, and so on. So it gives you a visual of the highly dynamic nature of kelp in many regions. You can actually download this data. So you have this geometry tool to quantify kelp abundance in area of interest. And so here I've highlighted this area, and we can now see with the bar graph the amount of kelp canopy area during each season here. You can see some, relatively high abundance in the 80s. And since then, we really haven't gotten back to those levels, at least in this area. Again, I think Sarah might go into a little bit more detail on these trends and their drivers tomorrow. But in the meantime, we'll show you can download this. So your area of interest, you can download a time series, analyze it however you'd like. And then I'll just finish up by going to another area. We'll zoom into Rogue Reef and just contrast that with Port Orford. So again, we'll highlight Rogue Reef here. You can see the time series. In this case, kelp has been relatively abundant in recent years. So interesting, again, an interesting contrast. So I encourage you all to play around with this tool, explore your favorite reef. Sarah is likely to be talking about these patterns, especially in Oregon in more detail tomorrow, so I'll leave that to her. But if I'm wrong about the topic of her talk, then definitely go and check out her 2020 ecology paper. So let's see. There we go. So here's the website. I have to admit, the Oregon data I just showed is from a beta version that will go live in the next month or so. Currently, if you go to the website now, it only has data for California, but soon again, we'll be expanding this to cover the entire West Coast from Baja to Washington. So stay tuned. Now, before I pass the baton on to Pat and Emma, I thought I'd just briefly show some large-scale regional patterns of kelp abundance along the West Coast that we've documented using this Kelpwatch data. So I've separated our entire data set into 6 regions here, and I'm showing a time series of total canopy area summed across each region from Washington to Baja. And one of the things that jumps out at me is just the really high natural variability in kelp abundance, both on an annual, interannual level, decadal scales. We see a lot of variability due to variability in environmental conditions like sea surface temperature, wave disturbance, climate cycles, grazing patterns, and so on, which makes it hard to detect long-term trends. And in fact, most regions, I'd say at the regional level, don't show any clear long-term linear trends, maybe with the exception of Oregon. Then in 2014, 2016, an extreme marine heat wave impacted this entire West Coast, causing major changes to coastal and marine ecosystems. And I've highlighted the time period in red so we can more easily see different regional impacts of this event. And most of my research focuses on California, so I'll just briefly say a couple words about the California regions. Many of you are probably familiar with the story in Northern California, but coinciding with this marine heat wave was the die-off of sea stars, which are an important urchin predator. And so there was this really dramatic collapse in kelp abundance, which we've yet to see substantial recovery. And it's really pretty dramatic on that Northern California time series. Kelp falls almost to zero and stays really low for years afterwards. Central California, this area was initially kind of resistant to the marine heat wave, but a few years afterwards, there were local observations of fronts of urchins causing barrens. This was a lot more patchy than in Northern California, largely focused around Monterey Peninsula. Kelp remained pretty abundant further south when you get past Big Sur into San Luis Obispo. But even given that, even given that spatial variability and the abundance in the southern portions of this region, you can still see that kelp abundance across the Central California region has been below average the last couple of years. Then in Southern California, most of this region experienced declines following the heat wave, a lot of variability in recovery. For example, Santa Barbara recovered relatively quickly while kelp remained below average in other areas, including some large forests in San Diego. And then Baja, there was a severe initial impact of the heat wave. Many parts of this region showed, I'd say, a surprisingly robust recovery in the years afterward, years following the heat wave. So just in summary, we're seeing a lot of variability, not clear long-term trends on these regional levels. I think there's kind of good news and bad news. The good news is that we're not seeing widespread negative trends, including areas like Baja and Southern California, which we would expect to be more susceptible to warming temperatures because they're towards the warm edge of at least for giant kelp. And kelp in many parts of these regions was surprisingly resilient to that 2014, 2016 heat wave. The bad news is that declines can be sudden and catastrophic, like we've seen in Northern California. I'm less concerned about long-term linear declines than I am about collapse, like we've seen in Northern California. And these patterns indicate that multiple stressors can really push these kelp forests beyond tipping points, where we get these large-scale state changes. So that's all I have. Thank you. Check out the website. Email me if you have any questions or if you want updates on when we're going to launch the full data set. I'm sorry you can't explore Oregon yet, but it's coming soon, I promise. With that, I'll pass it off to Pat.
Okay. Let me share my screen. Whoa, my goodness gracious. Are we all seeing my presentation? Yes, classic Zoom handoff. Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, Emma, for the introduction. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Chanel, so much for hosting this talk. Thank you to all the participants that are there. Thank you to everybody who might be watching this replay. And thank you to the Elakha Alliance and everybody for setting this symposium up. My name is Pat. I'm, as mentioned, loosely affiliated with the Monterey Bay Aquarium in that I do social media over there for the day job, but I'm currently coming to you as mild-mannered Underwater Pat. You can see it there on the name, but outside of work, I like to spend a lot of time taking photos and in kelp forests, specifically here in Monterey Bay. So this will be my photosynthesis of some thoughts that I've had swimming through the waterwoods. And if you have any thoughts, concerns, feedback, funny words of wisdom, anything like that, I'm right there at Underwater Pat on all social media, and then underwaterpat@gmail.com. But just a little bit about myself, maybe. When I was 5 years old, I saw the sea otters at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and I wanted to be a marine biologist and work at the aquarium. I grew up in France and in Sweden, far away from the ocean. And the whole time growing up, I was like, I'm going to try to do marine biology, but I had no idea what that meant. And I had no idea that scuba diving was a potential activity that I would end up spending so much of my time doing. I discovered scuba diving while doing my scientific research over at UC Santa Cruz, realized that the people that were diving were seeing a completely different world than what I was reading about. And so wanted to try my hand at that, and went from being a spunky marine biologist wanting to save the world to becoming a more bearded explorer in the kelp forest, trying to chronicle the story of what's going on in the kelp, because there's so little that we truly understand of what's going on out there. The data, as Kyle just showed, has a lot of story in it. And one of the things that I'm trying to do is try to contribute some pretty photos of what the data is representing. And so this is effectively the thesis of my talk. So if you get nothing else out of this, I love kelp. And I'm here to show you some kelp photos and give you some of my thoughts from out here. And I just started my timer, Emma, so I'm going to try to finish on time. But this is what I love. As Emma mentioned at the start of this talk, the Elakha, the sea otters, they're some people's favorite animals or some people's least favorite animals. It depends on whether or not you're an abalone or somebody on land with a pair of binoculars there. But sea otters, to me, they started my career or my thinking about the ocean. That was the spark that lit the fire that still burns about wanting to be in the ocean all the time. But after volunteering with the sea otters at the aquarium for many years, I really discovered that what I love the most is diving in kelp forests, seeing all the animals that live in kelp forests, seeing all of the fish and species and the richness of that environment. And sea otters are tangential. They help with this, but if nothing else, if sea otters aren't your favorite, this is what they help do, at least in our area here in Monterey Bay, is they create this kind of incredible environment of the giant kelp forest. And since we last spoke doing this talk here with the Elakha folks, I took this photo a few months ago in my favorite kelp forest. This is off of Monastery Beach in Carmel. And this was the first time that I was there with such incredible visibility that I could see the rows of kelp. It looks almost planted, like somebody put those kelp rows there. This corridor I've swam through days of my life now. And to think that a little weasel, a little sea otter out here foraging is helping garden this environment is really pretty incredible to think about. But even besides what the otters are doing, this type of environment is one of the most special places that I can describe. Diving into a kelp forest is sort of like if you lived your entire life on the surface of the planet looking down and all you could see is the forests of the world from the canopy perspective. And then you suddenly dive down into the water and it's like you've become an owl flying through the forest, hovering above everything. You get to see the understory that might be the ferns on land and then the palm kelps in the kelp forest. You might see little scurrying lizards or newts down in the redwood soil, and that would be like the sculpins or greenlings that we have in the kelp forest. And then up in the trees, you might find a murrelet nest hanging out on an old growth branch. And then in the kelp forest, you might be finding an entire squid generation laid on some kelp that a random cephalopod found in the night. It's really an incredible experience to be able to fly through that kelp forest, something that I try not to take for granted because scuba diving is not only so new, but very difficult, not very accessible for a lot of folks. And so my favorite thing about scuba diving here with a camera is that I'm able to share something like this with folks like yourselves, whether they be kelp nerds or just appreciators of what's going on underwater. There's not just giant kelp in our area. We've got bull kelp. This is a photo from recently out here in Pacific Grove. Bull kelp, as we saw, goes up onto the north coast. It's truly ethereal. It's hard to describe diving in a kelp forest that's made of bull kelp. But when we post things like this for the aquarium or for myself on my social media, a lot of folks who might be removed from the ocean, many folks are saying, well, that looks photoshopped. It took me a long time to see this as not being a computer generated image, some people will say. And so there's this thing about kelp. There's this thing about how captivating it is to look at. And I try to document all the kelp that I can find. I'm not just going to talk about the charismatic giant kelps and bull kelps out there for you kelp nerds. We've got the palm kelps. We've got the understory. There can be an entire forest within a forest in a kelp forest. We have the canopy forming kelps that you can see from the surface from those satellites. And then down underneath, you might have forests of 6 foot tall bits of northern sea palm, southern sea palm, which is northern sea palm is Pterogophora. Aclonia is a southern sea palm. Laminaria, the sea palms that you might find, the woody stiped algae you might find in the intertidal and also in your kelp forests. But even beyond those forest making friends, we've got even more algae hanging out there with the mist kelps, brown algae, red algae, coralline algae. And for me, diving out there with my camera, I'm just like that nudibranch there, just going, wee, this is the best the entire time while I'm in the kelp. But I spend probably most of my photographic time now dealing with giant kelp and bull kelp, where these have been some of the most important organisms to spend a lot of time with. They're prodigious organisms themselves. Giant kelp being a perennial alga that can live for many, many years, grow to be 200 feet long, growing from about 70 feet here in the Monterey Bay. And then bull kelp being an annual kelp that can grow to be over 50, 60 feet long in just one growing season. Truly some of the most superlative organisms that we have out here. Kind of take it for granted when they're washed up on the beach or seen floating out there in the open ocean. But these organisms define our coastline or make the coastline be what it is and what the coastline has been supporting people along this coast for 14,000 years and counting. So this is what it's all about for me. Scuba diving in the Monterey Bay. I get to spend 3 minutes at 15 feet every dive when there's kelp, just taking photos of the kelp. This is the growing blade of a giant kelp. You might recognize that as the Monterey Bay Aquarium logo. It's so satisfying to look at, calling this visual umami of each blade coming off of a solitary blade, each float coming off of that blade as well, and then eventually making its way around the stipe. Just an incredible pattern in nature. But bull kelp is probably, I mean, sorry if I'm causing any rifts right now in the kelp community, but I think bull kelp might be the most photogenic canopy forming kelp out there. This is some bull kelp flags that I found in the same location as the kelp corridor, just a few yards behind me there. just truly some of the most beautiful things I can think of. Here's classic giant kelp canopy. This is the kind of thing that, yeah, dreams are made of. And certainly I grew up in a very religious family, and I would say that diving in this type of kelp forest was the first time that I truly experienced that feeling of being connected to a world that's much larger than myself. The spiritual nature of the kelp forest is something that I'm always approaching or seeing through that door. It's like sometimes you can make it in there and just break through into that kelp understanding. And in our area, we've had a lot of interplay of different kelps. We've had the giant kelps, we've had Bulkhelper forests popping up. This was a reef that was scoured by urchins, and then the Bulkhelper came in behind that back in 2018. So when I took this photo of a new kelp forest showing up here in Monterey. And then in our area, as Kyle's data showed, we're very fortunate that we have this mixing of giant kelp and bull kelp, which is not very commonplace and something I hadn't really appreciated before doing this talk, talking to different folks, and then seeing the kelp disappear as it has in so many places. To have both in the same spot is really special. And here's a photo, one of my favorites, of the two canopy forming kelps fighting with each other for their light resources. So I take a lot of photos of kelp. It's just such a beautiful, beautiful thing. And it's been a resource for people for so long, let alone just, you know, the pixels that I can share over the internet these days, but the living resource that these organisms provide, that habitat that feeds countless organisms and that defines, again, that coastline, changes how the oceanography works and allows for there to be just such incredible diversity and resource for folks out here. Obviously, those have come under fire from these particular animals. You've heard the story. Purple urchins eat kelp. When they are out of control, then the kelp really suffers. And a lot of that has to do with the lack of sunflower stars in our area. These predators that historically would eat them, these are basically functionally extinct in Central California now. Some pockets survive, but these animals were crucial to help control not only the abundance of urchins, but the behavior of urchins. So understanding that kelp and urchins have been going through this battle for millions of years, and there are certain players in the field like the sunflower sea stars that change the tactics, that change the strategy. And without these animals around, well, we've had a lot of issues. Here's an example of an urchin barren with all of these brittle stars. This used to be a lush, vibrant kelp forest, and it was no longer that. This is one of the first photos that I took where I realized that I'm no longer just a biologist out here diving for fun. There's stories and important things happening that I'm documenting and that need to share out with folks. And so there's lots of different efforts going on to try to figure out what we can do with these urchins, with what's happening. These are some urchins. My friend Andrew Kim here from the Monterey Abalone Company is collecting these urchins for some aquaculture. There's another project down here you may have heard of, the Giant Kelp Restoration Project, that is smashing urchins to see what we can do for kelp gardening. But just kind of thinking about that collapse that Kyle was talking about, that thing that we're so worried about, and then our response collectively, thinking about the relationship that people have had with kelp for 10,000 plus years, again, along this coast. What does it look like when there have been collapses previously? This is our current response of tackling the urchin problem. And this is what so many of our kelp forests look like. This is why so many people are interested in kelp now, is they want this kelp to return. But as the data was shown from Kyle there, it's patchy. The data shows variation. This photo of urchins eating the kelp was taken 100 yards away from this photo, where it looks like nothing has happened at all. And so just thinking about the story of the kelp, it has to do with these little weasels here. In our area, we get to have otters that have helped protect patches of kelp, apparently, that have allowed the kelp to thrive even under these difficult circumstances. This is the second photo I ever took of a sea otter. And I was just as surprised as it was to see it. I thought maybe a bird had dove by me, and I looked over, and then there's our little kelp grizzly doing its thing. But so in our area, we've seen, and just like last time, Emma, I'm going over time, I apologize. But just like previous, we've seen in our area, a loss of kelp and a return of kelp, and sometimes not giant kelp, sometimes it's the bull kelp coming in behind it. These are some photos from this year of a leather star hanging out and some brand new giant kelp babies growing on what used to be a completely barren rock. Here's some southern sea palm that is growing up in this cold year that we finally had, the best kelp year that we've had along the coast in 7 years that I've seen. Bull kelp is popping up everywhere in these urchin barrens surrounding the giant kelp the surviving giant kelp that has survived on different pinnacles. And we've had some incredible days. This is just from a few months ago or a few weeks ago of the kelp doing great in areas where those otters have been able to stick around and do their work. And so thinking about how we have this progression of giant kelp to sea urchins to bull kelp, and thinking about what does our relationship look like with our forests on land, and how we have done a good job of getting rid of a lot of information that the people who have lived along this coast since times immemorial, they have a wisdom that was attempting to be eradicated about our forests. And now we're seeing a lot of those consequences in fire seasons that are extended, and as climate change progresses, those issues that we face there. And so what does that look like in the ocean, knowing that we're so far behind understanding what our water woods are doing compared to our land? What kind of insight is there about keeping forests going that we've ignored or trying to get rid of? And the spiritual connection that people have had with the kelp, if it, thinking about me spending 10 years diving in the kelp forest and how I feel about kelp, what is it like to have a coastline that has lived with kelp forever, or as long as people can remember? What is that spiritual connection? What does that mean for those people? And, for some people out here, it means continuing to work with animals and trying to work with the kelp and have that relationship. We have all this kelp thanks to the otters. So we have an abalone farm here locally where folks are able to work with the kelp and continue to feed themselves with a resource that is now in the wild up to the otters to control. And that leads me to the first photo I ever took of Elakha here, and that was diving at the abalone cages, where in our area we had no otters, and now we do. And we used to have all this abalone, and we still do. It's just in a different relationship now. So what does that look like going forward, this relationship that we have with the kelp? Those are thoughts that I didn't think I would have when I first started diving, taking these photos. I just thought, I'm going to take some pretty photos of stuff, but there's a lot of stories there. And the sea otters are responsible for my entire photo career and for the subsistence of countless people for the entire time that we've been along this coastline. So what does that relationship look like if we can get more of these little ones back up north? And then does that mean that I get to go up there and take some more photos of kelp in the future at northern latitudes? With that, way over time, Emma, I apologize, but thank you everybody for listening. And over to you, Emma.
Thank you, Pat. I never get tired of looking at Pat's images, and I'm so grateful to be in conversation with both Kyle and Pat because their perspectives informs the work that I do. So myself, I am a graduate student at UCLA in design and media arts, and I've been thinking about the kelp forest as concept for the work that I create. Let's see. Sorry, my desk is not sharing. That's weird. That hasn't happened before. Now it's working. Yay. So I've been thinking about the concept of kelp forest for my creative practice for about 4 years now. Unlike Pat and Kyle, I mean, we all have our own individual experiences with kelp. And one of the things I'm really excited about is learning how people learn about kelp. And I think that I might have a similar story to a lot of other people in the fact that this is my first interaction with kelp. I grew up in Southern California, and I really enjoyed going to the beach with family, and that kind of family-oriented activity of walking along sandy beaches of Los Angeles County and picking at some of these stinky, beautiful, wonderful kelp racks is what has inspired my work as an artist and fuels my passion to speak with scientists and to create art at the intersection of art and science that can visualize some projects that are happening. In 2018, I graduated from CSU Channel Islands. It's a small university growing now in Camarillo, California. And I studied studio art, but I took a lot of classes in environmental science. And this right here is one of my all-time favorite places. Actually, this is my favorite place ever. Maybe this is hard to guess. I know there's a lot of coastline in Oregon and California that could look very similar. You're probably also thinking, she probably likes this because it looks like there's a really, really big kelp rack, and it's true. This is Santa Rosa Island, and specifically this is Tecolote Beach. This beach is probably visited by no more than 5 people every single year. This island is under jurisdiction by the national park, and there's a research team that goes out there and collects marine debris. So they take transects on these beaches that nobody has visited other than sea lions. Sorry, I should say, there's other visitors other than humans, more important in my mind, being that this is such a fragile ecosystem for them that they rely on. So this is really what sparked my interest, is picking through this kelp rack on this beach and the other beaches on Santa Rosa Island, where the diversity of seaweed species was so high and the forms were really aesthetically enriching. Just seeing red and green and brown algae and all the different ways that they branch out and grow has been really intriguing for my art practice. So when I come back from this trip and they've processed the data, I help them carry out the trash, and I'm very excited to be a part of this and volunteering. What I do with it is I take those spreadsheets. They have all the different types of trash they've collected on the beach. They have the weight for each of those trash categories. And with that, I've been learning to program and learning to write some code to visualize this data. This is something that I'm very interested in, is how can I create patterns, visualizations, both representational and abstract, that talk about science in a different way. Here's another one of the monster pieces of rope that washes ashore. And I'm including this photograph because this was one of the materials that I was most drawn to. And this is fishing rope, fishing net, and lines. I was thinking about this entanglement between pollution in the ocean, kelp forest, and just this kind of really curiosity about giant kelp washing ashore in bundles with ropes, like plastic ropes like this. I remember asking at one point somebody who's studying the regeneration of kelp, I said, what do those chemicals, how do they affect the life cycle of kelp? Do they affect it? And I think I just have so many questions about the kelp forest and what's happening in that ecosystem, that this curiosity will just continue on in my life. I don't think I'll ever get tired of hearing about kelp and what's happening with it. Here's a photo of us carrying up the kelp, carrying up some of the trash. And this was a departure point to talk about kelp. I wanted to talk about kelp through the medium of plastic that I was finding on the beach wrapped up in the kelp. Here are some pressings of kelp. These are species that I found in Central California. I took some pressings on clay and high fired them, and they're woven into a tapestry that I made with marine debris rope that I collected on the beach. Here is a bull kelp and a not so happy bull kelp, Nereocystis and Splitcis, 2 pieces that I created completely with the trash that was collected on the islands. And this was a part of my goal to create this entire Anthropocene kelp forest, made completely with the contents collected by scientists during their cleanups. In the beginning of this year, I moved to Oregon. So at the height of COVID, and I got a residency up north, and I just decided to stay. I thought, am I really gonna go back to Los Angeles right now, or am I gonna continue to enjoy the kelp rack on the beach and the bull kelp that was washing ashore with the seasons? And so I decided the latter, and this became a point of inspiration for my artwork, Weaving Threads. So I was collecting some of the kelp that washed ashore rinsing it and coiling it over anything I could find at home that had the right shape to coil the seaweed. And playing with, going from working so much with plastic rope and then this fascination in weaving, and then now to using a natural material, I was really inclined to see the way that kelp behaves, and what that life cycle looks like after it exits the beach. Now it's on the kelp rack. And this was a really big curiosity to me. Also, the way that kelp wants to coil, it kind of has this tensile strength that I found really interesting. With each of these coils, I decided to create a community weaving event where I would send these coils, some hydrated kelp and some coiled kelp that was hard, to some friends, along with some wool and some ingredients to do natural dye. Because we were all quarantined at that time and I was still very much wanting to continue my art process, I wanted to explore connections to the natural environment near the home. So could you find leaves on a walk that could potentially have a pigment that you could dye in yarn? And how can you bring kelp into the home and think about kelp as a place of home? Here's a photo from, this is the workshop that we did to dye fibers, and everybody has a different plant matter that they brought with them to create a dye. The colors were really varied and the results were really beautiful. Then all together, we met over Zoom for a performance. And during this time, we listened to 20 minutes of interviews with scientists who have studied the kelp forest. Some of them who were in this participation, weaving with the kelp, Pat included, and a couple other friends who are scientists. And we're listening to the experience of diving under the kelp forest and what it means when the kelp forest is changing. I asked people to reflect on the experience as part of the performance. And a couple quotes that really stuck out where one of them was from Bobby Joe, thinking about the comments of the journey of these fibers or materials to get in our hands. It feels weird even to call them materials. These are other beings in different phases of their life or existence. I think this was a really interesting way of thinking of kelp. Pat also had a comment. So many people are seeing the kelp forest, but I hope that people can interact with the kelp forest by feeling and experiencing and touching it. And I think that this is the most I've ever handled kelp and been around kelp. Even though I have spent so much time in the kelp forest, I feel inspired to spend more time to interact with kelp in a different way. This tactile weaving awakens different parts of the brain that usually fire. And when I think of kelp and interact with it, it's great to see everyone's interpretation working with the kelp without any gloves, without any distance. Some of the results of this performance were some tactile weavings that people had created. A lot of the fibers that people had chosen and dyed were personal threads from their life, maybe an old t-shirt that they'd worn for many years, an old tea towel that they used to cook with. And it kind of gave these kelp coils another life. More recently, now I'm interested in looking at kelp underwater and thinking of it as a site to explore change. And my thinking of doing this is taking photos and video that can be translated into 3D models that can show a transect of kelp forest or a reef using some identifiable points to show, what does it look like now and how has it changed? So from 5 or 10 years down the line, if Elakha were to reintroduce sea otters to the coast, if some of the restoration efforts like coaling were to take place, what's our hope for the kelp forest? What's a hopeful restoration? What do we want to see? What do we want out of this space? And I've been working with Kyle and working with Pat to look at these spaces differently and to speculate our presence in this environment and how we depend on kelp and how other beings depend on kelp. So thank you again so much for having me here today. And it's been a pleasure sharing a little bit of my work, and also again to be in conversation with Pat and Kyle is always a pleasure. Yes, so I think now we can pass it off to Q&A.
Super. Thank you all for another wonderful presentation. I can just watch the same thing you do over and over and learn new things. I love it. Okay, so we had one question that Kyle already asked or answered, but we could probably do it verbally as well. Mark asked, is there a reason why Oregon's kelp declined and has stayed there for fairly a long period of time?
Yeah, no, what I was saying is that, when you look at the regional time series, it's really driven by a couple sites in Southern Oregon that, dominate that regional time series. Again, with the caveats that with the Landsat method, we're, not detecting some of these small nearshore sparse beds. So in the Landsat data set, that regional Oregon time series I showed is driven by a couple southern sites, some of which has seen some declines, specifically Orford Reef and Depot Bay.
Oh.
And so, many, just to make clear, many other reefs have not seen a decline. They've been stable, or in a couple cases there have been increases, but these tend to be smaller kelp forests, and so that regional decline is really those two sites. And so whatever's going on there, I think is driving that decline. And as I mentioned, I haven't studied this area closely, and so other folks that have more local knowledge that have studied this area probably be better positioned to answer that. I definitely recommend asking that question to Sarah Hamilton tomorrow. I can speculate since it's such a persistent decline, it hasn't recovered to those 1980s level. It's something that is long-term. And so, we've seen in other locations where sedimentation causes long-term habitat loss, or in Southern California, we've seen areas of, when water quality declines, you see long-term loss of kelp. And so it could be sedimentation, changes in water quality, potentially persistent grazing, although it's a pretty long time for that to occur. But I've seen urchin barrens that last years, if not decades.
Great. If you have any questions, reminder to use the Q&A feature. I guess I'll throw out a question for you all. Unfortunately, not everyone is going to be able to go scuba diving and experience a kelp forest on their own. So what's the best way, do you think, for them to get involved and really have a passion for kelp forests like we all do without actually going underneath the water, since it's not really the easiest place to go and see?
Snorkeling, definitely snorkeling. If you swim, go out, snorkel. I mean, you can see a lot of the same things from above the kelp canopy as you can see from below. Maybe if you, get comfortable with it, you can dive down a little bit, but, at your own pace and slowly enough to see some of those benthic creatures as well. But even just going to the beach and seeing tide pools. I think tide pools are a really great place to learn about other types of seaweed, maybe not necessarily kelp forests, but actually I think that's where I started, between the kelp rack and between the tide pools. It's a really good place to learn about the ocean.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, that's definitely one of the things about scuba diving, especially in cold water, is that there's so many different filters around it, from geography, economics, and then physiology of being able to go scuba diving. Some folks have a bad sinus infection when they're a kid and then can't clear their ears enough to go scuba diving. So it's definitely not something to take for granted. To echo what you're saying there, Emma, the tide pools, especially the low intertidal, have their laminarias and their own kelps, their feather boas, and you can see a lot of those same interactions. So you could study kelp forests in the intertidal if that was of interest. But not to plug the aquarium too hard, but we have a kelp forest exhibit there if you want to see what it's like underwater. There's multiple different public aquaria around the world that are trying to exhibit kelp, and you can get a good approximation of what it looks like by visiting those. But getting involved with the kelp is just a matter of reading up on some of the history of your coast, reaching out to the people that are involved with the kelp and seeing what kind of help they might need. You know, there's so many different people out there doing so much work with kelp that requires so much analysis time, or, you know, somebody to show up and help prep things. You know, there's a lot of people out there that just want a little bit extra help on the stuff that they're doing on land before they go out there. So definitely recommend getting involved with folks. And the Elakha Alliance is a really great example of one of those orgs doing a lot of work with kelp, where you don't have to be a diver necessarily to get involved. So
yeah, I think, you know, getting out into nature is the best, but I'll also, you know, chime in on the value of aquarium on documentaries. You know, when I was a child growing up, I lived far from the ocean. And really developed a love just going to aquariums. In my case, the Baltimore Aquarium, which is you know, pretty cool marine aquaria. And then documentaries, other videos, you know, My Octopus Teacher. There's a really cool old IMAX video on Kelp Forests. There's some Blue Planet episodes. So that could kind of, I think, develop an interest that then can inspire you to go out to nature or to help out with some of the programs that Pat mentioned.
Yeah, I totally agree. I am the one who has like all the Blue Planet DVDs, and I have some Cousteau DVDs too.
Yeah.
All the nature stuff. That was a huge part of my childhood, falling in love with the ocean. So good suggestions. Thanks.
And related to Cousteau, if people want to see progress that you can make in terms of your understanding of the ocean, if you watch old Cousteau versus new Cousteau, you see a very different relationship with the environment there. So it's kind of fun to watch that. Anyway, sorry for bringing that up.
No, that's fine. Okay, we have a question that came in. James asks, any thoughts on kelp farms for everyone? Good, bad, otherwise, tasty? What are your thoughts?
It's a complex question. I think it's a really good one, because there's a lot of interest in kelp aquaculture, restoring places that used to be kelp forests and building artificial kelp reefs in new areas. I think it's all about the details, right? What habitat is it displacing? Where is it located? I'm kind of a more optimistic side. Like, I think there's a lot of potential for using artificial reefs for things like multi-trophic aquaculture. We're still, you know, a little ways away from the regulatory components, but I think there's potential, especially on the kind of growing edible kelps, multi-trophic aquaculture. There's a lot of interest for kelp farming in kind of carbon storage purposes. I'm, you know, maybe a little bit more skeptical to that end, but on, you know, potential nutrient, you know, eutrophication remediation, nutrient uptake, I think there's some potential there. So I'd say I'm optimistic. I think there's some potential benefits of kelp farming if it's done correctly.
Yeah, to build on that, you know, obviously there's good ways and bad ways of doing it. There's good ways of doing aquaculture of shellfish like abalone. There's bad ways of doing aquaculture of shellfish. So one thing I will say is that there's a lot of interest in it. There's a lot of people that are out there trying to work on it, including a lot of friends and coworkers that work at Moss Landing Marine Labs and a few other places where people are trying to grow not only edible kelps for people to eat, but also kelps that can maybe be fed to livestock to help cut some of their greenhouse gas emissions through those famed burps and farts that the cows are up to. So there's just a lot of interest in the kelp. And when I think about that aquaculture of it, I think about what our relationship with kelp has been like, and especially what the Western mentality around the natural resources that we have has been, where kelp is not a part of our diet in a big way. Whereas if you think about other like, you know, us white folk out here, but kelp being an incredibly important part of like Korean food culture and just kombu and like everything there, where it's just in everything because it's available. And so related to kelp aquaculture, leading up to that, several friends of mine, and we've done a few pop-ups during the pandemic of food where we specifically try to get people to eat a lot of kelp because it's delicious and tasty and like makes everything so much better. So I think if we along the coast start eating more kelp, the kelp will do even better, I think, as people understand more of what it is in your life there. Anyway.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting topic and a great question. I'm not opposed to it, and I've been speaking with some people who have been genetically selecting some, doing restoration by genetically selecting kelp species. This is in Australia, Dr. Craig Johnson, genetically selecting kelp and replanting it on substrate to kind of imagine what aquaculture. There seems to be a lot of experiments around aquaculture, like USC's Elevator Project, this one in Australia that I found out about. I recently saw an article about 6 women who started their own aquaculture farming on the East Coast. I can share that article. So I think kind of, yeah, is it good to plant trees? Is this a good metaphor? I'm not sure if this is. So it's going to continue to sink carbon. So that's great. Can you really replicate an environment? I mean, have we been successful in that in the past? I'm a little bit cautious about that. And what Kyle was saying too, I think makes a really good point. Like, where are you placing these kelp forests? Are these supposed to be sandy bottom? Like, think about that geomorphology of the coastline, and by placing something there, what are you changing? And I think it's just always good to look at all the repercussions of things, but also gain some perspectives. Maybe I can try to dump this link to this one farming I thought was really cool. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the comments mentioned kelp as a fertilizer, and absolutely, that's been a historical use of it as well as cosmetics, food additives. There used to be a pretty large harvesting of natural kelp forests in Southern California that moved out of California due to economic reasons in the early 2000s. And I think this next question about that impacts on fish. I guess it depends. I think the idea for kelp aquaculture or farming is not to cause declines in natural populations. And for some species like Macrocystis, the giant kelp harvesting was shown to be to not have significant negative consequences on giant kelp abundance. They would just take the top few meters or few feet, and the kelp quickly regenerated. It's a little bit more tricky with bull kelp, but yeah, I think the idea is that we're not doing this to avoid declines in natural kelp populations.
Right, and adding to that, the abalone farms, that there's still 2 that are operational that I'm aware of in California. The abalone farm here in Monterey hand harvests, the first 3 feet of kelp, where people are bending over the side of this aluminum boat, chopping it off, putting it into these cages, and then feeding the abalone. And they did an assessment back in, I think in the 80s, with the farm, and they realized that the kelp forest that they were harvesting from created 220,000 tons of kelp every year, and they were harvesting around 200 tons of that. So very minimal impact in terms of the amount, given how prodigious the kelp is. So being done well, you could harvest natural kelp for the aquaculture, but if you're growing kelp now, if you can decouple what's happening in the ocean with kelp resources, you start getting into this interesting circumstance for livelihoods and ways of eating sustainable, good food that is being done in ocean right now. But yeah, lots of complex stuff. I'm down to take photos of whatever though. So if anyone's working on a kelp farm, I'll go take that photo.
Awesome. Well, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. It is 8:03. So as part of our Sea Otter Science Symposium, we are doing fun giveaways if you are here participating with us. And so at the start of our presentation, I took everyone's name and put it in a random picker. And congratulations, Chase, Woolner, you won a really awesome sea otter print featuring some kelp. So I have your contact info through your registration. So we will send that off to you because it's in Bob's house at the moment. So I'll have to work with him to get it to you, but we'll get it to you. So congratulations and thanks for sticking on and joining us for our keynote presentation this evening. For tomorrow, our second day of the symposium, we have Lynn Lee talking about ecosystem effects of renewed sea otter presence, Dr. Salvador Jorgensen talking about great white sharks and sea otters, Sarah Hamilton, who is our Oregon kelp researcher, talking about status and trends. So if you're really interested specifically in Oregon, jump onto her presentation. And then Dr. Alan Shanks discussing Dungeness crab, life history and considerations for sea otter return. So with that, thank you, Emma, Pat, and Kyle for joining us this evening. If you have any parting words you'd like to say, feel free, and thanks again.
Thank you.
Who attended, and thanks again, Chanel and Bob. It was great to be here, and Pat and Kyle, thank you.
And thanks to everybody for participating tonight. We appreciate it.